Hello, my name is Tice Winkleblack, and I am a member of the Board of Directors of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, and I'm glad to see you have joined us today for our presentation by Brenda Longfellow, Associate Professor, Head of Art History Division, School of Art and Art History at the University of Iowa, who will be speaking today on the topic, Bread and Circuses, the Female Patrons of Ancient Pompeii. I would also just like to thank our members and our volunteers and interns for making these forums possible. I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, University of Iowa's International Programs, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and I thank today's special sponsors, Allison Kin Atkinson and Midwest One Bank. I also, as always, thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4, or 118-2, as well as the UI Library's digital archives. Please be sure to like City Channel 4 on Facebook. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Brenda Longfellow. Brenda Longfellow is an associate professor and head of the Art History Division at the University of Iowa. She received her Ph.D. in classical art and archaeology from the University of Michigan, and her research is focused on the art and architecture of the ancient Roman Empire. She is the author of the book Roman Imperialism and Civic Patronage, Form, Meaning, and Etiology in Monumental Fountain Complexes, and co-editor of the book Roman Artists, Patrons, and Public Consumption, Familiar Works Reconsidered. She is also the 2019 recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities summer stipend, which she tells me is a wonderful tool to saying no to other requests that may pop up, because everyone knows that you shouldn't ask a fellow for the National Endowment for the Humanities to do other duties as assigned, because they get to just work on their own research for that as part of that program. She was also the 2013 Andrew Heiskell Post-Doctoral Rome Prize winner at the American Academy in Rome. And I would like to invite Brenda to the podium, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Pace, for that kind introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming to hear this lecture. I also want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for providing me with that summer stipend. Some of the research that I did this summer you'll see today. So today, I am talking about how women were active economic and social agents in the ancient Roman world. The fact that women were involved in business transactions and social decisions is really not something that's highlighted in the ancient historical sources that we have. When our ancient authors talk about Roman women, they usually are talking about them in terms of how they're living up to or not living up to the ideals of what are considered female virtues. And these virtues include being beautiful, modest, fertile, faithful, and of utmost importance is being a good mother and wife. So really the focus is on the household. But if we turn to the archaeological record, we get glimpses of the activities of women in the community and outside of their primary role of wife and mother. The Roman city of Pompeii provides some of the best evidence that we have for female agency in the civic arena. And so today I'm going to use Pompeii as a case study for thinking about the different ways in which women were patrons of ancient Roman communities. I'll begin with a brief overview of the city of Pompeii itself, explaining why it is so rich in material about the lives of women. And you got a glimpse of that in the trivia questions the interns prepared for today. Those are great. Thank you. And then I'm going to introduce the basic ways in which Roman women were involved with money and social decisions before talking about 3 specific women in Pompeii. One of these 3 women was criticized for not being a public patron, and the other 2 were actually public patrons. And these 2 public patrons include Macchia, whose portrait I have on the screen today. And she actually paid for the largest civic building in the entire city. Just give you a glimpse of how prominent these female patrons could be. So let's begin with Pompeii. Pompeii is located about 125 miles southeast of Rome and along the Bay of Naples. And this rather ordinary town was made remarkable by its extraordinary state of preservation when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE. And this map shows you the fallout from the eruption. You can see that Pompeii is really in the heart of it. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it spewed so much ash and lapilli into the air that within 24 hours, the entire city of Pompeii was buried up to the middle of its 2nd story. 24 hours. This catastrophe transformed this regional town, just basically of regional importance, and had about 20,000 people in it. And it transformed this regional town into one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. From the clothes, and here's what the city looks like today. Thank you, Google Earth. And so about 2/3 of the city is excavated. The unexcavated portion, you can see, if I can get the cursor, maybe not. Sorry, let me get that. The unexcavated portion is up in the upper right-hand corner. So the eruption preserved really evocative carbonized evidence of organic materials that remains unparalleled by finds from other Roman sites. These organic remains include people. From these remains, we can see the clothes they're wearing, the hairstyles of the men and the women. We also have the loaves of bread that were left baking in the oven that morning of the eruption. The eruption started around 11 a.m. And also we have the wooden doors and shutters that were bolted against the onslaught, like these that you see here from the Villa of the Mysteries. So this is one of the reasons why Pompeii just captures our attention. And for those of you who are familiar with Pompeii, when you think of the city, I'm sure that female patrons are not the first thing that come to mind. Perhaps you first think of the extraordinary wall paintings that covered the entire walls of the rooms and also their ceilings. And then the floors also had mosaics. This is one of the most famous ones. The women in the scene are about life size. This covers the entire room. Or perhaps you first think of well-preserved examples of architecture, like this outdoor dining space that is actually in a building that was being rented by a woman. Her name is Julia Felix. And this is really a fascinating space. What we have here are stone couches upon which people would recline. You have 3 couches for a total of 9 people. The guest of honor would sit in the back left-hand corner. And as they would recline while they enjoy entertainment and a multi-course meal, the setting was made even more pleasant by the use of slaves. You have on top of the roof, you have a small cistern, and that staircase in the middle of the wall, kind of a staircase to nowhere, that actually is for artificial waterfall. So basically, slaves will be on the roof pouring water down. The cistern is really small. After about 5 minutes, they need to refill it. So if you're going to have it running throughout the entire dinner, you have a lot of manpower behind that. Okay, and then the front of the room. If we turn around and look out at the view that people had from this room, it's this gorgeous garden. This is an interior garden at the back of the house. Absolutely typical for Pompeian houses to have these interior gardens. And what we have here, this green space with this colonnaded walkway, shaded walkway you could walk around and talk in. And then also running down the middle, there's this water course that actually had fish ponds in it. So you could grow your own fish if you'd like. So you have this lush garden space. If you've been to Pompeii, you've seen lots and lots of these. So outside of the domestic space, Pompeii is also famous for its streets, these nice, straight Roman roads. This is what we expect in a Roman town. These are equipped, let's go to more of a detail. These streets are equipped with these really tall sidewalks on either side, and then you have a series of stepping stones across the street itself. Can you see those? The stepping stones? Well, these stepping stones are really important because what we're missing in this image is the raw sewage that's slowly oozing towards the Sarno River down the street itself. Okay, so the stepping stones are important to avoid that. These streets, of course, are lined with the facades of houses and businesses. And here I show you just the facade of that rental accommodation of Julia Felix. And you can see that the facades are made interesting by architectural elements. And then also you see the benches on either side of this doorway. And those are for the people who would be sitting out there waiting to have an audience with the homeowner. Also preserved along the city streets are graffiti and election posters. What we're looking at here are some election posters on the outside of this business. And in Pompeii, we have evidence for 2,800 election posters, and 51 of those name women. Women, of course, can't vote, they can't run for office, but we do have women voicing their backing of particular candidates. A grandma, for instance, urged everyone to vote for her grandson. Okay, so another aspect of Pompeii that may come to mind before thinking about female patrons is the Forum of Pompeii. This is the economic, religious, and administrative heart of the city. And what we're generally missing as we look at these houses, streets, and civic spaces are the people who built these spaces. And as we'll discuss today, these people include women. So the picture we get of Roman women from the textual sources, as I said, is really focused on how they live up to feminine ideals for the most part, and that their primary purpose is to marry and have children. But when we turn to the material evidence in Pompeii, we have evidence of women doing all sorts of activities, and these women are coming from all sorts of social classes. So I wanted to start by breaking down what types of women we have in Pompeii, from what parts of the social hierarchy, and then we'll talk about what they're doing in the civic sphere. And so our women in Pompeii actually include members of the imperial family, members of the emperor's family. Livia has a couple statues set up in her honor. She's the wife of the first emperor of Rome. Even more present in the city is Nero's second wife, Poppaea Sabina. She was married to him for 3 years. It's pretty good for Nero's wife. And she is famous in the historical sources for her adultery and her beauty. She's praised for her bathing routine, which included her skin was amazing, and they attributed that to bathing daily in donkey's milk. So she actually has close connections to the Bay of Naples, and Pompeii in particular. She owned outright in her own name, she inherited a piece of property in Pompeii, and it's been suggested, different houses have been suggested as being the one that's owned by her. The house of the Menander is the one that most people hit on. Okay. In addition to having imperial family members present, we also have Pompeian political and economic elite. And this is the group that we're going to focus on today. The three women that we'll be talking about today, I list their names for you here: Mulvia Prisca, Macchia, and Eumachia statues on the right. These are the three patrons that we'll be talking about. And when I say the political elite, what I mean are those families where members of the family are elected into office. And then once someone has become a magistrate, they then are on the town council for life, unless their wealth drops below a certain level or they are considered morally bankrupt. In either case, they can be kicked off of the council. But basically, the members of the political elite are the ones who are on this council, and the men are on this council running the city, and then the women in their family are eligible for things like becoming public priestesses. And what a public priestess is, it's a position either in the imperial cult, the cult for the imperial family, specifically for the emperor usually, or priestess of Venus in Pompeii, or priestess of Ceres. And these positions, we don't know if they're annual or they're for the lifetime, but we do have 13 women in Pompeii, including Macchia and Humanities, who are public priestesses. And so we know that they are members of the political elite. Economic elite are those people who we don't have evidence that anyone in their family was part of the town council, but the family had a lot of money in their possession, or a lot of, I should say, property in their possession. In addition, other women we have present in Pompeii, if we keep going down the social hierarchy, we have less wealthy, freeborn women, including our landlady, Julia Felix, who rented out these really nice accommodations. And then we also have, beneath the freeborn women, we have what are called freed women. And these are women who were slaves, and then during their lifetime, they were freed. Now you can either buy your freedom or be given your freedom. And what happens when you become a freed person is you're still part of your former master's larger family, but you're a very different status than a slave, which is, of course, at the bottom of the social rung. So we have evidence, we have names of freed women and slaves in Pompeii. A lot of the slaves are, we have the names that we have are associated with, there's a couple in taverns, a couple in the brothel, I should say. So this is the social hierarchy of women present in Pompeii. I'm going to show you how women on each of these levels have economic power. I'm not going to talk about slaves, I guess, specifically, but I will say that some of the buildings in Pompeii are made with tiles that were produced by a clay field owned by a slave of Livia. The slave's name is Abda, and on these tiles it says Abda, slave of Livia, and she's the owner of these clay fields that are producing tiles for buildings in Pompeii. So just to give you a hint of how people are able to spend money, control money, on all these different levels. Okay. In general, what we know about Roman women, just broad strokes, they could own property, they could conduct business transactions, and then for those political and social elites, political and economic elites, they could be public benefactors, they could be honored by the community, and members of the economic elite, members of the political elite could also be those public priestesses. Okay. Now, the three women we're talking about, two of the three were public priestesses, two of the three were public benefactors, and one of the three was honored by the community. And we'll work through and why only one was. And when you're honored by the community, what can happen is the community can erect a statue in your honor. This is really important because it's something that's there in perpetuity to remind everyone of this quid pro quo relationship between you and the community. And then also, another really important way to be honored is with funerary honors. The town council could pay for land for your tomb, they could pay for your funeral expenses, they could pay for the tomb itself. So what I want to do now is actually turn to the tombs of Pompeii, where we can really see the economic agency of women from all levels of society. In a Roman city, the tombs are going to be lining the roads leading into the town. And so they're on the outskirts here. I can't get if you can see the road right here, we have tombs lining this road. And what's really interesting is if we look at the tombs, a lot of the tombs, especially 36 tombs in Pompeii, still have their inscriptions associated with them that tell us who paid for the tombs. And half of the tombs have a female either completely paying for it or paying for it with a partner. Okay, and so if we look at just a group of the tombs, this is what these tombs look like. They're all oriented towards the road. You're supposed to see and be seen with your tombs. You want a really prominent display so the people who are walking into town notice your tomb and kind of stop and remember you, remember your family. This group of tombs that I'm showing you here, there are actually 4 tombs. This one is the tomb of Macchia, so we'll come back to that tomb. It's actually the largest tomb in Pompeii, okay? This tomb right here is really interesting because it is paid for by a man and woman, and the man is freeborn and the woman is freed. And then this tomb over here is actually paid for by, again, a man and a woman, and they're both freed. And so in the cemeteries, we can really see how people are able to control how their money is being spent and the choices they're making and what they're spending their money on. And this includes people from all walks of society and both genders. I want to go to another cemetery on the other side of Pompeii to look at one particular tomb of a woman, or paid for by a woman. And this is this tomb right here. We're actually standing at the gate to the city with our back to the city walls, looking at this tomb. You can see here's other tombs beside it, but this is the tomb we're going to focus on. And this tomb is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, if we look at the inscription, it's right here is where the inscription is. Let me show you a detail of it. And here's how it translates. This is a tomb. It's dedicated to Gaius Vestorius Priscus Aedile, which is a lower level magistrate. So he'd been elected into office, a lower level office, and he probably died during this year in office. He lived 22 years. His burial place was granted, along with 2,000 sesterces for his funeral, by a decree of the town council. Mulvia Prisca, his mother, set this up at her own expense. And so a bereaved mother paid for this tomb on this land that was given to him by the town council. Now, this in and of itself is really interesting for a number of reasons, but this tomb gets even more interesting because we have a response to it recorded in the graffiti that was etched on the outside of the tomb. Okay, so we have this mom. She's built this tomb for her son, okay, on land provided by the town council. And then if we go to the tomb itself, on the exterior, when this tomb was excavated in 1908, the excavators recorded a graffito that has now been lost. But this is how the graffito read. Mulvia Prisca pours out her grief here and has no peace. It would be better if she distracted herself by financing a gladiatorial spectacle. This is why Pompeii is so fascinating, because you get not just the action of someone, but you get the reaction. And here we have a woman being criticized because she's not providing the bread and circuses that this one passerby, at least, was expecting. And so I brought this in as a really nice example of how our expectations of who it is who are funding spectacles for the community don't always match up to what our evidence like this gives us. When someone is elected into office, they aren't paid for the position. When a man is elected in office, he's not paid for the position. Instead, it's an honor to be elected. And as part of your being in office, you are expected to give back to the community. And part of that giving back is giving back spectacles, paying for oil in the baths, paying for part of a building project. As part of your term in office, that's what you're expected to do. What this graffito is telling us is that women with economic means have some of that same pressure on them. And to show you this, the spectacles and how they usually are announced in Pompeii. So if you see the large oval up here, this is actually the amphitheater in Pompeii. It's our oldest known amphitheater, predates the Colosseum in Rome. This dates to 80 BC. And what we have on the exterior of a building that's built by Macchia that we'll talk about in just a minute, we have a poster announcing games. And here is the poster, the word text of the poster says, "The gladiatorial troupe of Aulus, Suidius, Certus, Edile will fight at Pompeii on May 31st. There will be a hunt and awnings." And so he's not just paying for the gladiators. There's also in the morning, there'll be an animal hunt, and he's also paying for shade for the spectators. And the Pompeian posters, announcements of games, they often emphasize that they're doing that. So it seems to be an extra thing. Notice he's edile, so he's doing this during his term in office. And this is exactly what we expect. What is unexpected is that a woman would be criticized for not doing something similar. So let's turn to the two women who we know gave public buildings in Pompeii. And what's really interesting about these two public buildings is that they're actually in the civic, economic, religious, and administrative heart of Rome. They're in the Forum. So here I'm showing you a Google Earth image of the Forum of Pompeii. And what we have, this is the Forum. Right here is where voting happened. Over here is where, this is the Basilica, this is where law cases were heard. Among other things, lots and lots of graffiti in this building, suggesting people waited around a long time there. And then down here are where the offices were of our magistrates, our elected officials. This building right here was paid for by a woman, and so was this one. And this is Macchia's building, the largest building in Pompeii, public building in Pompeii. Okay, we're going to start with Macchia's, and then we'll go to Macchia's. So what we have with Macchia's building is we have this religious space. We have, you see, an altar. Sacrifices would take place here, and then this is a small temple. In the Roman world, most of the religious activities take place not in the temple. The temple is where the god resides, where the cult statue of the god is, but the activities would mainly take place in the sanctuary, the surrounding sanctuary. So you have to imagine this space with people in it. And here we have the dedicatory inscription for this structure. Macchia, daughter of Publius, public priestess, built this to the genius of Augustus, the spirit of Augustus, and she built it on her own land and at her own expense. So she's really emphasizing that she is providing not just the money for the building itself, but she actually owned the land that it was built on. If we and this is interesting because we have, just like we had a response to Mulvia Prisca's tomb for her son, we actually know the response to Macchia's benefaction, her civic benefaction. If we go back to the tombs of Pompeii, she has a tomb, and this tomb is actually this bench, right, that you see here. It's right against the road. You can see from the steps that a lot of people have used it over time to sit there, take a moment, take a breather, and so behind here is where her ashes would have been. That part is missing, but this is in a part of the city. It's within 100 feet of the gates of the city, which is considered the sacred boundary of the city, and you're not supposed to be buried within these 100 feet. You only have very special burials there. And this tomb, if you look, you can see the inscription in large letters. These would originally have been picked out in red, so you could actually see them very easily. But this is what the inscription for the tomb says. It says, "To Macchia, daughter of Publius, public priestess." So we know we have the same person, yes. A place for burial was given by decree of the town council. And so here we have a woman being treated in the same fashion as other public benefactors of the town. They give something to the town and they're rewarded with a place for burial. Now, this doesn't always happen, which is interesting, and we'll come back and talk about why perhaps Macchia received this. If we go back to Macchia's building, this is an extraordinary building. It's multi-purpose. There's a lot going on here. I'm going to go down to the level of the forum so you can see what it looks like from the forum. It's even in its ruined state today. It's really impressive. So here we go. Here you see the dedicatory inscription went all the way across. Here you can faintly see the letters. And here's a bit more of the dedicatory inscription. And we're standing in the forum, and it would be picked out in bright red. Everyone could see this just marching along the forum, and this is what the dedicatory inscription said. Macchia, daughter of Lucius, public priestess. She built, and she lists the parts of the building. The Chalkidicum, which is basically this part in here, had lots and lots of statues. She built a porticus, it's a public garden, surrounded by a colonnaded walkway. And the crypta, she built this at her own expense and in her name and in the name of her son, Marcus Numistrius Fronto. She dedicated all these parts to Augustan peace and concord. And so here we have a woman who's created at her own expense, this enormous facility that is for the use of everyone. And essentially because she makes sure that everyone knows that she dedicated it, but she's doing it in the name of her son as well. And so people have suggested that perhaps he was running for political office and this was her way to try to help him. But when we say that, we're ignoring that the focus is on Macchia throughout, right? So this building, I want to walk you through the building a little bit because it's so impressive. Here we come up to the entranceway. You had statues of Romulus and Aeneas over here. We don't know which statues were over here. Presumably you had statues of the important people in town, including members of her family. This is a statue base here, in this porch, which she called the Chalkidicum. What's interesting is this porch area actually has 2 elevated platforms in it. And it's been pretty much decided that that's where auctions took place. People have suggested that these are slave auctions in the town would have taken place here, but of course other goods could have been sold here as well. And of course Romans would think of slaves as goods, as property. If we move into the building, move through that doorway, what we encounter is something that looks a lot like that interior garden space that we saw in the estate of Julia Felix. We have this open space in the middle. This is actually the first public garden in Pompeii. And so it's this nice space, and it was surrounded by a colonnaded walkway. The columns are gone, but you have to think of this nice shaded walkway all around it. And you'd think that'd be enough, but if we move to either side of this space, what we have here's the public garden out here. What we have back here is a more secure area. This is the crypta that she mentioned in the inscription. What we have over here is a place where probably more expensive goods were sold, goods that needed to be protected, needed to be able to be locked up. So maybe some expensive textiles is a guess of what could have been sold back here. And the reason why people guess that textiles were sold back here is because Macchia clearly had a close relationship with the fullers in town. The fullers produce cloth. They clean cloth. Romans use urine to clean cloth. And so for a while there was a guess that those platforms were where people would urinate to leave the urine for the fullers to collect. But why you need to be elevated, I don't know. But anyway, so we know that Macchia had a close connection with the fullers who clean cloth, who are involved in the cloth making process. How do we know that she has this close connection? Well, that statue of Macchia that I've been showing you periodically throughout this talk, it actually comes from this complex, and it has the dedicatory inscription associated with it. So here's that statue again with the inscription that it stood on top of. It had a base that said, "To Macchia, daughter of Lucius, public priestess. The Fullers set this up. And so here Macchia is being honored not by the town council, but by a particular group in Rome that feels an affinity with her. Her husband was involved with the cloth-making industry. And here they are dedicating this really public honor to her in her building. And so this, of course, makes us think, how did the town respond to this really wonderful gift she gave the community? First public garden, enormous space for the buying and selling of goods. The answer is, we don't have any evidence that they responded to this at all. In fact, if we go back to her tomb, it actually has the dedicatory inscription on it. And her tomb tells us that she paid for it. So Macchia, daughter of Lucius, made this tomb for herself and her family. And so where Macchia received her tomb from the town council in thanks for the services she provided for the town, we have complete silence for the town's response to Macchia's benefaction. And this, I think, is really important to think about, because a lot of times when we think about the ancient world, we do these blanket statements. Women are, either doing this or doing that. But when we start looking at individual benefactions, individual monuments, we can see that everything is really on an individual basis. And so if we go back to these three women and their tombs, what's interesting is if we put them in chronological order, we can maybe see a rhythm or a reason for why Macchia may not have received public thanks in the funerary realm for what she did. So the first of the benefactions is Macchia's. So Macchia's the first of these three, and she receives the traditional thank you in the form of a tomb from the town council. The next of these is Macchia, who goes far beyond what Macchia did in terms of her benefaction, and yet there's radio silence from the community. And so here we're seeing expectations being different from reality, perhaps. And then Mulvia Prisca's tomb comes after Macchia's. And here we have a sense of how the expectations of what the women will be doing in the community have perhaps been raised, maybe in part because of what Macchia did, maybe in part because of what Macchia and Macchia did. And so what we are seeing here in Pompeii is not just the public buildings that are dedicated by women, but also how the town has responded or not responded, how individuals have responded. And this is all, of course, just thanks to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the way that the entire town was preserved with the graffiti, with the inscriptions, with the architecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Brenda Longfellow for her talk just now on bread and circuses, the female patrons of ancient Pompeii. Thank you. I'm going to start with the large letters because I did not bring my reading glasses. So here's one I know I can read. Here's a couple of questions. Did Pompeii have any affordable housing? And is Mulvia Prisca's tomb covered by a modern structure?
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good questions. Yes, that is a modern shed to protect it. The interior of the tomb has an extraordinary cycle of wall paintings, and so the shed was built to protect those from the weather. Yeah, so the green thing here, this is all modern. Okay, the tomb itself, it's this altar shape, and then the stone walls below that. And then in terms of affordable housing, yes, it did. So basically, if you were a Roman, you wanted to live on the bottom floor. Okay, that's where you had running water. That's less danger from fires, all that good stuff. In Pompeii, we have, if you walk around the city, you'll see on the exteriors of buildings, you'll see staircases going up. And those staircases would be to separate accommodations than what are on the main floor. So they'd have their separate entrances. And a lot of those seems to be small enough that they would be more affordable housing. They would be housing, you wouldn't have those grand garden spaces. You wouldn't have those grand living spaces like that stone triclinium we saw.
Good, thank you. And now I can read. Is anything known about Macchia and the others and how they acquired the money to finance major buildings? Was this only through inheritance, or did they have business interests and conduct business transactions of their own? And then also a sort of a footnote question about Macchia and her dedication to her son, and just sort of the lack of also noting a husband and whether or not that would have been a usual type of dedication.
I have to say this question makes me very happy. I've written an article on this. I hope you notice, I'm going to start with the last part of it, of whether or not she had a husband, Macchia had a husband. I hope you notice that Macchia also identified as a daughter versus a wife. And what's interesting in Pompeii, this is what I wrote the article on, is if you look at all the public priestesses we have 13 known, they all are identified and self-identify as daughters. And so what that tells us is that that is the tradition of the position. It's not telling us what their marital status is. In general, scholarship on Macchia assumes that her husband is dead because he's not mentioned in the inscription. But that doesn't have to be the case. We do know that a Marcus Numistrius Fronto was duumvir, which is the higher of the elected offices in Pompeii. And that could have been either her son that's mentioned in the inscription or her husband, because they had the same name. So names get confusing in the Roman world because a lot of times the father and son will have the same one. If that was her husband who was duumvir in 2 to 3 AD, it may be that he died in office, perhaps. It's not clear if that Numistrius Fronto finished his year in office or not. Okay. Where did her money come from was the other part of the question, right? So Macchia comes from a wealthy family. And when we talk about wealth in the Roman world, we're really talking about wealth in terms of property. To be of the equestrian class in Rome, the city of Rome, you had to have 400,000 sesterces of property, basically. We think in Pompeii, in order to be on that town council, you'd have to have 100,000 sesterces of wealth and property. Okay, so her family got its wealth through the tile industry. And I can't remember the other source. Her husband also is from an established wealthy family, and his family got its wealth or has wealth in cloth making. And so what's really interesting is the dedication to her of that honorific statue by the cloth makers in Pompeii. It's to her, and it doesn't mention her husband, right? And so it suggests that if she is a widow at this time, she's taken on the business connections that her husband had with the cloth makers. Did I miss a part? No? Okay.
Here's a fascinating question. Was there competition between the female patrons? I mean, you touched a little bit maybe about how the expectations could have changed over time, but specifically between the patrons of Pompeii and the patrons of towns, in other areas or nearby or far away.
That is a great question, and I wish I had the information to answer that. Pompeii is completely unusual because we know the name of a single female patron. It's the only town that I know of where we know the name of more than one female patron. The other famous female patrons are in the east. The Pergay is a city in modern-day Turkey. It had a woman named Planca Magnia, I think, or Magnia Planca, sorry, and Magnia Plancia. And she paid for this city gate that had statues of her family in it, which is nice, yes. She really is. She and Macchia are the two most famous of our Roman female patrons. We have others, and if you start looking at really mundane things like the pipes that feed the aqueducts, or that run from the aqueducts to feed fountains, feed baths, they're stamped with who's providing the water, or who's providing, I should say, the piping, and you have women's names on those. So women are there. It's just that scholarship hasn't been particularly interested in really seeing the big picture of who's doing what in individual cities. So I can't say if there was competition between individual female patrons between different cities. I wouldn't be surprised if there was. We just need to be more aware of what the evidence is telling us about these female patrons and their existence. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Two questions. It appears from your comments that women owned property, and this person is asking whether or not they were they the legal owners of this property. And then also, can you talk a little bit about the duties of public priestesses?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's both great questions. So, yes, women legally owned items. What's interesting with the Roman world is that technically women always had a male guardian, and there were basically two ways in which a woman got married. One where she became like her legal relationship to her husband became that of a daughter. That was not normally used in the time period we're talking about. In the time period we're talking about, the woman remained part of her original family, and so when she was married, she'd come with a dowry, but her husband was not in control of her property. Now, if they got divorced, which is actually fairly common, especially among the upper class in Rome, if they got divorced, she was at fault for adultery or something, she would a certain amount of her dowry would stay with the husband. The rest would go back with her. We know that, we know even from the evidence I gave you today that women owned property. Our landlady, Julia Felix, is renting out the accommodations. She owned those. Our inscription, Macchia said she built the temple, the sanctuary, on her property with her own money. And so we do know that they owned property. Usually when our historical sources talk about women owning items, they talk about personal effects like jewelry and such. They don't talk about women as having these, holdings outside of the realm of man. But we do know, just from the evidence I showed today, that they do have that. The other question was about the public priestesses and what their duties were, this is not exactly clear. What we know is that different cults had priestesses, and they were led by priestesses. And usually these were cults of female deities. So in Pompeii, these were Venus, who's the patron deity of the city, and Ceres, who's an agricultural goddess. And so women were the 13 public priestesses we know of from Pompeii, were priestesses of one of those two cults. But you also have public priestesses for the imperial cult. What exactly the women would do? Good question. They would lead different rites, but what those rites are, we can't say. I mean, we know that all of these cults involve sacrifice. For a long time there, it was suggested that women couldn't participate in sacrifice, but that, as people look more closely at the evidence, that seems to not be the case. Women probably were participating in sacrifices. As I can't be more specific about what exactly they did, just that they were the figurehead for that cult.
Thank you. We wish we could pull out even more information, right? I think, this questioner just wants you to maybe talk a little bit more about how, just asking, is there any evidence suggesting how Macchia and Macchia's stature in the community impacted other women's positions in society? And maybe that's difficult to know, but we'll have you take a quick stab at it anyway.
At a basic level, we don't know. We have all of the evidence we have for Macchia, I've shown you today. For Macchia, we have one more piece of evidence of what she did in town that I haven't shown you, and that is actually she dedicated something. Remember, she's a public priestess. She's actually a public priestess of Venus, the patron deity of Pompeii, and we actually have a dedication that she left at the temple for Venus. And so we see her activity in 3 parts of town. But from this activity, we can't see a direct response to any of it. Her building is the only one with this public garden. No one mimics it, so we don't have other people emulating her gift to the town in any way, male or female. Her tomb is the largest, takes its own form. It had images of Amazons on it, which you don't have anywhere else in Pompeii. She really did her own thing with her tomb, and we don't have that emulated either. So there's no way to say that how these women's activities affected others, except to say that we do have Macchia is our earliest known public priestess, and we do know of this whole line of public priestesses, and so what we have is an interest in having women. I don't know. I can't even say that. I don't think. What I was going to say is maybe there's a sense of that women should be giving public services to Pompeii in a way that wasn't there before Macchia's building, but really we have no evidence to say that other than our graffito that we have on Mulvia Prisca's tomb.
Good. And moving away, sort of women specifically, could you talk a little bit about the freeborn and the freed slaves and slaves? Were people born into slavery, and how did they get freed?
Yeah, so as we know, the Romans had a lot of military victories. And with those military victories, people were enslaved. So if you lost to the Romans, you could become a slave. So we have a lot of slaves coming into Italy, and they're coming from all different parts of Europe and Asia. And once you're a slave, you can accumulate money, and so you can actually pay for your freedom if you accumulate enough, or you can be freed. Your master can decide to free you. And during the time of Augustus, it was so popular to free people in their wills. So if someone would die, they'd say, and all my slaves are free. This was so popular that Augustus limited the number of slaves you could free in your will to 100. So people were born into slavery, of course. We know how much different slaves cost. We know, if you remember, the town gave 2,000 sesterces for Fulvia Prisca's son's funeral. Well, we have 2 slaves who were sold at Pompeii for the combined price of 2,000 sesterces. So we know that slaves were sold there. We know that slaves were used as collateral in loans. We have a woman. We have actually this exchange between 2 women where one basically takes the slave as collateral until the other woman pays back her loan. So I mean, this is a slave-based society. Everywhere you look, you have this often to the Roman eyes invisible workforce, making sure everything is running as it should, with the garden, with the parties, with the water. I mean, everything takes manual labor, and slaves. Well, once a slave was freed, they became part of the former owner's extended family. And so even if you were freed, say your former owner had a fullery, and you worked in that fullery, so you have certain skills, right? Well, if you were freed, you'd be able to profit off those skills, but you'd still pay your owner a certain percentage of that. Your former owner a certain percentage of that. So you never lose that tie. And in Roman society, if you were a slave, even if you became incredibly wealthy, which a lot of the imperial freedmen do, you still always have that stigma of being a former slave. Your children, your male children, could run for office. So takes basically a generation. They still are going to have that stigma of being descended from slaves, but they actually are considered freeborn citizens. And in Pompeii, we have this really interesting temple of Isis that was mentioned in your trivia, and there was an earthquake in the 60s AD, and it was rebuilt, and the person who rebuilt it was this 6-year-old who then was rewarded for this rebuilding with a seat on the town council. And so it's his father is assumed to be a freed man. And so this is a way of the family having this social mobility through the next generation. So Roman society is really, your social status through the generations can really fluctuate a lot.
Well, thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our questions. I know we didn't quite get everybody, so hopefully you may get a chance to speak with Brenda Longfellow briefly after this program. So I just want to say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I also want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa's Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, for their generous support, as well as our special sponsors, Ken and Alice Atkinson and Midwest One Bank. And again, thanks to City Channel 4 for all you do to make our programming available. Brenda, you have come to programs, so you know that you now have won the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
I've been waiting for this. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you, and we are adjourned.